She was 8 months pregnant, broke, and completely alone. But when her ex showed up out of nowhere, after abandoning her months ago, everything changed. What he didn't know? Someone was watching. A quiet man with 2 grocery bags in his hands and a storm in his past. What happened next would test the strength of a woman, the heart of a father, and the meaning of family. Stay with me, because this story will stay with you forever. Before we start, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. The knock on the door was an intrusion, loud and impatient against the quiet hum of the apartment. Sarah, heavy and slow in her final weeks of pregnancy, felt a jolt of unease. James was out picking up a few things for dinner. She waddled to the door and opened it, and the world tilted. It was him, Mark. Sarah, well, so this is where you've been hiding, he said, his voice a slick veneer of charm over a core of steel. He didn't wait for an invitation, pushing past her into the small living room. His eyes, cold and assessing, scanned the modest space with open disdain. Cute place. Bit of a step down for you, isn't it? What are you doing here, Mark? Her voice was a fragile whisper, but there was a new kind of strength in it, a spine she hadn't had months ago. I came for you, of course, for the baby, he announced, as if bestowing a great gift. Look, I made a mistake, a huge one. My parents, they're ready to help, but only if we're a proper family. He gestured toward her belly, not with affection, but with a disturbing sense of ownership, as if she were a mislaid possession he decided to reclaim. His gaze fell on the freshly painted yellow crib in the corner. His jaw tightened. Who bought you this? He demanded, his tone shifting from persuasive to accusatory. That's none of your business, Sarah said, taking a protective step back toward the crib. You left. You forfeited your right to ask questions. Come on, Sarah, be serious, he scoffed, closing the distance between them. The scent of his expensive cologne filled her with a nauseating wave of memory. You can't raise a kid in this dump with some janitor. Our child deserves better. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly tight. We're leaving. Now. At that exact moment, the key turned in the lock. The door swung open, and James stood there, 2 grocery bags in his hands. His gaze flickered from Sarah's frightened face to Mark's hand clamped around her arm. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. He didn't hesitate. The bags dropped. A glass jar of pasta sauce shattered on the worn linoleum, splashing red like a wound. In 2 long strides, he was between them. Take your hand off her, James said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that held a dangerous calm, far more intimidating than any shout. Mark sneered, letting go of Sarah as if her skin had suddenly become hot. And who are you? The handyman? Stay out of it. This is family business. This is my home, James stated, planting his feet as if he were an oak tree growing from the floorboards. And she is under my protection. You need to leave. She's having my baby, Mark yelled, his composure finally cracking. A baby you abandoned on a street corner, James countered, his voice unwavering, each word a carefully placed stone. You don't get to walk away when it's hard and then stroll back in to claim the prize when the work is done. A father doesn't get to choose when he feels like being a father. He stays. He protects. He builds. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time. Leave. Finding her own voice, a voice forged in the quiet safety of the last 2 months, Sarah stepped out from behind James's protective form. She looked Mark directly in the eye, her fear finally eclipsed by a cold, hard clarity. He's right, Mark. Go. There is no us. There is no family for you to join. You don't get to walk back in. Her resolve seemed to deflate him more than James's threat. He stared from her resolute face to James's unyielding stance, realizing he had no power here. With a bitter curse that hung in the air, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. But to truly understand why this moment matters, we have to go back to the day everything changed. 2 months earlier, there was no door to slam, only the indifferent glass of a bus shelter. The rain didn't just fall, it judged. Each drop that hit the transparent roof was a cold tap on the shoulder, a relentless reminder of her failure. For Sarah, curled on the hard plastic bench, the drumming was the only sound in a world that had gone utterly silent on her. 7 months pregnant, completely, terrifyingly alone, she had become a ghost, invisible to the headlights that sliced through the dark, wet street before abandoning her to the shadows again. She pulled a coat that was far too thin against a wind that felt cruelly personal. One hand rested on the tight swell of her belly, a protective gesture that was more instinct than conscious thought. A single tear, hot with shame, tracked a path through the grime on her cheek. She wasn't looking for a bus. The last one was an hour gone, a fact she knew with chilling certainty. She was looking up with the vacant stare of someone trying to remember what hope felt like. The fight with Mark played on a torturous loop in her mind. His face, contorted not with anger, but with a chilling detachment. A baby wasn't part of the plan, Sarah. His bags were already packed. My parents will disown me. My career. I can't do this. He hadn't even looked at her as he walked out, leaving his key on the counter of the life they were supposed to build together. Her own family had offered platitudes and distance, their disappointment a wall she couldn't climb. And so she had ended up here, at the end of the line, in every sense of the word. In the suffocating silence, a question hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. Was this it? Was this the end of her story? Miles away, James was tired in his bones. It was a deep, grinding exhaustion that came from 12-hour shifts spent erasing other people's messes. As a janitor in the city's biggest hospital, he was a ghost of a different kind, an expert in being overlooked, a silent witness to pain and relief. But the physical fatigue was a feather compared to the leaden weight of being a single father to his 7-year-old son, Leo. His entire existence was a fortress built of rigid routine and razor-thin budgets, a carefully constructed dam designed to keep the world's chaos from flooding in and washing away the little life he'd built for his boy. Driving home in a truck that rattled like a jar of loose change, his mind was on Leo. Was he asleep? Did he remember to eat the mac and cheese he'd left in the fridge? These were the thoughts that were his fuel, the worries that kept him going. He almost missed her, a flicker of motion at a bus stop he knew went dark after 10 p.m., a trick of the rain on his weary eyes, he told himself, but his mind replayed the image, and the shape resolved into a woman, huddled and dangerously, unnaturally still. His first instinct, the one honed by years of self-preservation, was to keep driving. Don't look. Don't stop. Getting involved was a risk, a deviation from the meticulous plan that kept him and Leo afloat. It wasn't his business. He was just a janitor, a man with nothing extra to give. What could he possibly offer but more trouble? He passed the bus stop, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, but the image of her was seared into his vision, a photograph burned onto the back of his eyelids. He thought of Leo's mother, of the deafening silence she left behind when she decided this life wasn't enough for her. He knew the hollow ache of abandonment from the inside. 100 yards down the road, his foot slammed on the brakes, the old truck skidding with a screech on the wet asphalt. He couldn't. His own father, a man of few words but deep integrity, used to say that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he had, but by what he did with what he had. James didn't have much, but he had a running truck, a warm apartment, and a choice. With a deep sigh that felt like it released all his carefully constructed excuses, he pulled a sharp, reckless U-turn, the headlights cutting a hopeful arc through the miserable night. He pulled up slowly, the engine idling, and rolled down the passenger window. The rain immediately began to mist the inside of the cab. "Ma'am," Sarah flinched, pulling into herself as if expecting a blow. She looked up and saw a man whose face was etched with a fatigue she recognized in her own soul, but his eyes held a cautious, respectful concern. Her every instinct, sharpened by betrayal, screamed, "Don't trust. Don't get in the car." But her legs were numb with a cold that had sunk into her bones, and his voice held a strange, steady gravity that cut through her fear. "Last bus was an hour ago," James stated, not asking. It was a simple observation, devoid of pity. "It's freezing out here. You can't stay." He didn't pry or ask what had happened. He just laid out the undeniable facts. "I can give you a ride somewhere." Sarah looked from his face to his worn-out truck, then down at her swollen belly. A kick, a small, insistent flicker of life from within. It was a different kind of survival instinct. Not for her, but for the baby. "I don't," she started, her voice cracking from cold and disuse. "There's nowhere to go." The admission was a final surrender, the last brick of her pride crumbling away. James paused. The weight of her words settled in the cab of his truck, heavier than any physical load he'd ever carried. This was no longer a simple ride. This was complicated, dangerously so. He thought of the city shelters, overcrowded and grim. He thought of the small, warm apartment waiting for him. He thought of the spare room, cluttered with old toys and boxes, but dry and safe. It was a reckless, irresponsible idea, but looking at her, shivering and broken in the rain, he saw a mirror of his own past loneliness. This wasn't about being responsible anymore. It was about being human. "Look," he said, making a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. "I have a spare room. It's not much, I promise you that, but it's warm and it's dry. You can stay the night, just for tonight. Figure things out in the morning." He hesitated, then added the only thing he had of true value. "I have a son. He's 7. You'll be safe." The mention of his son wasn't a line. It was an offering, the most valuable collateral he possessed. For Sarah, his offer wasn't a lighthouse beaming across the sea. It was a single, flickering match, struck in an endless, suffocating dark. It was terrifying, but it was the only light there was. With a trembling nod that took all of her remaining strength, she stood on shaky legs and walked toward the old truck, toward a complete stranger who had turned around in the rain. The silence in the truck was thick with unspoken questions and fears. Sarah sat pressed against the passenger door, as far away as she could get, watching the city lights blur past through the rain-streaked window. James just drove, turning the heater up to full blast in a small, practical gesture of care. When they arrived at his modest apartment building, he led her up 2 flights of stairs. He opened the door, and a smell hit her, not of anything fancy, but of a life being lived. Faint coffee, clean laundry, and the waxy scent of the child's crayon drawings taped proudly to the wall. A small boy, with his father's serious eyes and a mop of messy hair, appeared in the hallway, rubbing the sleep from his face. "Dad, you're home late." "Hey, buddy." James's voice softened instantly, the exhaustion melting away. "Go back to bed. This is Sarah. She's going to stay with us for a bit." Leo looked at Sarah, his gaze open and disarmingly curious. "Are you having a baby?" he asked, pointing directly at her stomach. Sarah, who had been bracing for judgment, felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble under the weight of his innocence. A small, real smile, the first in what felt like a lifetime, touched her face. "Yes, I am." "Cool," Leo said with a giant yawn, and shuffled back to his room. That one simple, accepting word did more to calm her fears than any promise from an adult ever could. This was a home, not a trap. James showed her the spare room, a simple bed with a mismatched quilt, a stack of clean blankets, and a fresh towel on a dusty dresser. "It's not much," he said again, almost apologetically. That night, for the first time in months, Sarah slept. She didn't dream of the shouting matches with Mark, or the sight of his packed bags by the door, or the cold indifference of her family. She just slept, a deep, dreamless sleep, shielded from the storm, both outside and in. The next morning, the smell of coffee and slightly burnt pancakes pulled her from the room. James was at the stove, a look of intense concentration on his face that she would come to learn he applied to everything, from fixing a leaky faucet to flipping a pancake. Over that simple breakfast, their stories emerged in hesitant pieces. Sarah spoke of a fairy tale romance that had soured into a nightmare, of a family that valued appearances over her well-being. James spoke of a wife who had left, seeking a bigger, brighter life than the one he could offer, and of the daily struggle to be enough for his son. His empathy wasn't pity, it was recognition. He was a man who knew the profound, silent ache of being left to face the world alone. In the days that followed, a quiet, unspoken routine formed, slowly. Drawn out by Leo's boundless energy and open heart, Sarah started to emerge from the cocoon of the spare room. She helped him sound out the words in his favorite dinosaur book. She started to cook, filling the apartment with the comforting aromas of stews and baked bread. Her way of saying thank you without having to find the words. For James, coming home from a grueling shift to the smell of a warm meal was a forgotten luxury. He hadn't realized how painfully silent his home had been until Sarah started filling it with life. The weeks turned into 2 months. The spare room became Sarah's room. One Saturday, they found a second-hand crib at a thrift store. Its paint peeling, but its frame sturdy. James spent the entire weekend painstakingly sanding it down and refinishing it. Together, on a floor covered in newspaper, they painted it a cheerful, sunny yellow. The act of preparing, of building something for the future together, with shared laughter over paint splatters and quiet moments of understanding, felt more significant and more real than either of them dared to admit. They were no longer just a man, a woman, and a boy. They were something else, something taking shape. Their connection was a quiet, slow-growing thing, built not on grand pronouncements, but on the sturdy foundation of small, everyday kindnesses. He learned she had a dry, surprising wit that surfaced when she felt safe. She learned he hummed terribly off-key when he was fixing things around the apartment. They were two fractured people who, without realizing it, were carefully, patiently mending each other. But the past rarely stays buried forever, and it was then that the knock came, shattering their fragile peace. After Mark stormed out, the silence he left behind was heavy with relief and the lingering shock of the confrontation. The shattered jar of pasta sauce on the floor seemed to symbolize the messy, broken pieces of Sarah's past, now swept away. She began to tremble, a delayed reaction to the fear and the adrenaline. James turned, his focus entirely on her, his hands gently taking her shoulders. "Are you all right?" She shook her head, tears of relief and gratitude finally falling. "Thank you." The words were inadequate. She buried her face in the rough fabric of his work shirt, and he held her, offering a clumsy but solid comfort until the storm inside her finally passed. Later that evening, sitting at the small kitchen table, the unspoken feelings between them had to be faced. The air was thick with them. "He was wrong, you know," James said softly, breaking the silence. "About this place being a dump." "What you said to him," Sarah began, her voice thick with emotion. "About what a father is. You're a good father, James. You are an incredible father to Leo, and you've been more of a father to this baby than he ever was." James reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "Sarah," he said, his voice earnest and stripped of all pretense, "when I found you at that bus stop, I was just a tired man trying to get home. I never imagined this. You and Leo, you didn't just fill a spare room. You brought my life back into color. It's not just my home anymore. It's our home, if you'll have it." It wasn't a grand declaration of love from a movie. It was a statement of fact, a quiet, humble acknowledgement of the family they had accidentally, beautifully become. "Yes," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy. "Yes, I'll have it." 2 weeks later, Sarah went into labor. It was James's hand she squeezed until her knuckles were white, his voice that coached her through the waves of pain. He stood by her side, an unshakable anchor in the turbulent storm of childbirth. When a healthy, screaming baby girl was born, the first person to hold her, after Sarah, was James. He looked down at the tiny, perfect, wrinkled face, and then at Sarah, his eyes shining with a love as real and profound as any bond forged by blood. Together, they named her Hope. A year later, a sun-drenched park is filled with the sound of laughter. James pushes an ecstatic Leo higher and higher on a swing. Nearby, Sarah sits on a checkered blanket, bouncing a chubby-cheeked Hope on her lap, the baby giggling with delight. Their life wasn't a fairy tale. It was real. The truck still coughed and sputtered to life each morning, and the budget was still a puzzle with too few pieces. But it was a life filled with the triumphant sound of a little boy reading a story to his baby sister, the comforting smell of burnt pancakes on a Sunday morning, and the quiet, unshakable contentment of a family that had found its anchor in one another. James leaves the swing set and sits on the blanket, wrapping his arm around Sarah. She leans her head on his shoulder, watching their children, and thinks of the desperate, invisible woman she was at that bus stop. It feels like a story about someone else entirely. The rain she once saw as despair now just feels like rain. A storm had brought her here. A storm had led her to a single dad janitor with a heart big enough to shelter them all. It's a strange calculus, how a single decision, a U-turn on a rain-slicked road, can rewrite an entire future. It wasn't about a grand plan. It was about one good man, fighting his own exhaustion, who chose to see a stranger in a storm, and in doing so, found his own way home. Sometimes, the smallest gestures have the power to rebuild entire lives. If this story of hope and second chances moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will touch your heart. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what part of this story resonated with you the most? Thanks for being here. We'll see you in the next one.